Orange County, California, summer 2020. Outside hospitals, ambulances line up faster than nurses can unload patients. Inside cramped apartments across Little Saigon, elderly residents sit alone, terrified to leave their homes. The government promises help. Millions of taxpayer dollars are rushed into emergency relief programs designed to feed vulnerable seniors during the worst public health crisis in modern American history. But while desperate families wait for meals, someone else is getting rich. A young law student suddenly buys a $1 million house. Political insiders quietly funnel money through shell companies. County employees become too afraid to ask questions. And somewhere inside Orange County's government, a powerful politician begins operating what federal prosecutors would later describe as a reverse Robin Hood scheme, stealing from the poor to enrich the powerful. This is the story of Rhiannon Do, a refugee who escaped communist Vietnam with nothing, only to become the center of one of California's largest corruption scandals in recent history. And by the time the FBI finally moved in, millions of dollars had already disappeared. Before we continue, we noticed that over 90% of the people watching our videos aren't subscribed. So if you enjoy deep investigative documentaries like this one, subscribe and help us reach 10,000 subscribers before July. Now, back to the story. Long before the scandal, Rhiannon Do was seen as a success story. He was born in Saigon, South Vietnam, on April 23, 1963. Then came 1975, the fall of Saigon. As communist forces took control of South Vietnam, thousands of families fled the country in panic, among them the Do family. Like many refugees arriving in America, they started with almost nothing. No power, no wealth, no political connections, just survival. The family eventually settled in Garden Grove, California, inside what would become one of the largest Vietnamese communities outside Vietnam itself, Little Saigon. For many immigrant families there, politics wasn't just politics. It was identity, anti-communism, community loyalty, survival. And Rhiannon Do understood that world perfectly. He studied hard, earned a degree from UC Davis, then a law degree from UC Hastings. By the 1990s and early 2000s, he had become a respected attorney and rising figure within Orange County's Vietnamese American political circles. To many residents, he represented the American dream, a refugee child who made it. But behind the polished image, questions were already beginning to follow him. In 2008, Rhiannon Do won a seat on the Garden Grove City Council, but almost immediately, political opponents began accusing him of something unusual. They claimed he didn't actually live where he said he did. Public records showed Do owned a home in North Tustin, outside the district he was supposed to represent. No charges were ever filed, but the allegations didn't disappear. Then in 2015, the exact same controversy returned. This time, Do was running for Orange County's powerful Board of Supervisors, a position with enormous control over county spending, contracts, and public programs. Again, critics accused him of secretly living outside the district. Again, Do denied wrongdoing, and eventually, he won. For most politicians, residency scandals are embarrassing side stories. But looking back, these accusations revealed something important about Rhiannon Do. He understood systems, and more importantly, he understood how to bend them without breaking them. That skill would eventually become worth millions. The Orange County Board of Supervisors isn't flashy. Most Americans have never heard of it. But inside Orange County, it controls enormous power. 5 supervisors oversee a county budget worth nearly $9 billion annually. Public health, emergency relief, housing, infrastructure, healthcare contracts, disaster response. And during COVID, that power exploded. Suddenly, billions in federal emergency funds began pouring into local governments across America. The goal was speed. People needed help immediately. Rules became looser, oversight became weaker, and panic created opportunity. For someone willing to exploit the chaos, COVID relief programs became the perfect target, especially in communities where vulnerable elderly immigrants depended entirely on government assistance to survive lockdowns, which is exactly where Andrew Do's district came in. Little Saigon was hit hard during the pandemic. Many elderly residents didn't speak English fluently. Many lived alone. Many were terrified of leaving home. The county urgently needed organizations capable of delivering food and services directly into the Vietnamese community. And then, a new nonprofit suddenly appeared. In 2020, a nonprofit called the Viet America Society, or VAS, was formed. At first glance, it looked legitimate. Its mission sounded noble, helping vulnerable Vietnamese seniors during the pandemic, providing meals, supporting the community, honoring Vietnam War veterans. But there was something strange about VAS. Almost nobody had heard of it before millions of dollars started flowing in. And somehow, this brand new nonprofit immediately began receiving massive county contracts connected directly to Andrew Do. No competitive bidding, no normal public process, no transparency. Money simply started moving fast. Between 2020 and 2023, more than $10 million in federal COVID relief funds were directed toward VAS. Some reports would later estimate the real number closer to $13.5 million. The funds were specifically meant to feed elderly homebound residents during one of the deadliest public health emergencies in modern history. But prosecutors would later argue that feeding seniors was never the real priority, because hidden inside VAS was a massive conflict of interest, one Andrew Do allegedly never disclosed publicly. His own daughter was deeply connected to the organization, and investigators would soon discover the charity wasn't just receiving taxpayer money. It was becoming a pipeline designed to quietly move public funds into private hands. Rhiannon Do was young, still in law school, only 19 years old, when VAS was created. Publicly, the organization presented itself as a charitable nonprofit, serving the Vietnamese American community. But behind the scenes, federal investigators say something very different was happening. Money from VAS began flowing into intermediary businesses. One company allegedly started receiving over $100,000 per month connected to county-funded contracts. Then, that same company began paying Rhiannon Do approximately $8,000 every month. By 2024, she had reportedly received around $224,000 through this arrangement alone. But investigators say that was only part of the story, because in July 2023, $381,500 tied to VAC funds were transferred into an escrow account. Soon after, Rhiannon Do purchased a $1.035 million home in Tustin, a luxury property far beyond what most law students could ever afford. To complete the purchase, prosecutors say fabricated mortgage documents were used to secure a $600,000 loan, and while vulnerable seniors waited for pandemic relief meals, a political family was allegedly using taxpayer money to quietly build wealth. But the deeper investigators looked, the worse the story became, because this wasn't just corruption. According to federal prosecutors, it was an organized system, and inside Orange County government, people were becoming too afraid to stop it. By 2021, some Orange County employees were starting to notice something wasn't right. Contracts tied to Andrew Do's district were moving unusually fast. Questions about paperwork were quietly ignored. Competitive bidding requirements seemed to disappear. And according to later forensic audits, staff members began feeling pressured not to challenge anything connected to Do's office. The audit would eventually describe an environment built on intimidation. County workers allegedly feared angry phone calls from Andrew Do or his chief of staff, Chris Wongsaporn, if they slowed contracts down with oversight questions. Employees weren't just bypassing procedures, they were learning not to ask questions at all, because inside local government, power doesn't always need threats. Sometimes fear alone is enough, especially during a crisis. COVID had overwhelmed agencies across America. Everyone was exhausted. Programs were rushed. Emergency funding moved faster than oversight systems could handle. And prosecutors believe Andrew Do understood that perfectly. Because the deeper investigators dug, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't random greed. It was infrastructure, an entire system designed to quietly redirect public money through carefully controlled channels. And at the center of that system was the Viet America Society. Federal prosecutors would later describe the operation almost like a laundering network, not cartel-level sophistication, but sophisticated enough to hide corruption behind layers of transactions. Here's how investigators say the system worked. First, Orange County approved taxpayer-funded COVID relief contracts connected to Andrew Do's district. Those funds were directed toward VAS. Then VAS allegedly began transferring massive payments to outside businesses. One company, identified only as Company Number 1, reportedly began receiving more than $100,000 per month. Soon after, money from that company allegedly started flowing directly toward members of the Do family. Monthly payments, mortgage support, escrow transfers, property purchases. Another business, an air conditioning company identified as Company Number 2, allegedly became another pass-through channel. 3 separate $25,000 checks connected to VAS money were reportedly routed toward Andrew Do's other daughter, and eventually, investigators say, the money circled back to Andrew Do himself. Federal records later revealed nearly $15,000 used for property taxes on real estate owned by Do and his wife. Another $15,000 allegedly used to pay off personal credit card debt. The image prosecutors painted was devastating. Pandemic relief money intended to feed vulnerable seniors being quietly transformed into personal wealth. And while the public still had no idea, investigative journalists were beginning to notice strange inconsistencies because millions of taxpayer dollars had started disappearing into a non-profit almost nobody understood, and eventually, someone started following the money. The scandal may never have exploded publicly without one thing: journalism. Reporters at LAist began investigating strange county spending connected to Andrew Do's office. At first, it looked like another local government story most Americans would never hear about. But then they found something explosive. Rhiannon Do, Andrew Do's daughter, a young law student with ties to the nonprofit receiving millions in pandemic relief funding. The conflict of interest was staggering because, according to investigators, Andrew Do had never publicly disclosed how deeply connected his family allegedly was to the organization receiving taxpayer money, and once reporters began asking questions, everything started unraveling. Fleece's investigation triggered outrage across Orange County. County officials demanded audits. Lawsuits followed. Then federal agencies got involved. The FBI, the IRS, the Orange County District Attorney's Office. What started as suspicious bookkeeping was now becoming a major federal corruption investigation. And behind closed doors, panic was spreading because investigators were no longer looking at isolated payments. They were beginning to suspect something much larger: a county-wide corruption hiding inside emergency COVID spending. In 2024, the investigation exploded into public view. FBI agents raided properties connected to Andrew Do and his daughter. Suddenly, the story dominating Orange County headlines wasn't pandemic recovery, it was corruption. Federal investigators seized financial records, electronic devices, and banking documents. Then came another major escalation. In August 2024, federal authorities seized more than $2.4 million directly from bank accounts tied to VAS and associated companies. The government believed the money itself was evidence of criminal activity, and by this point, the political damage was becoming catastrophic. For years, Andrew Do had cultivated the image of a disciplined public servant, a refugee success story, a respected figure in the Vietnamese American community. Now federal prosecutors were preparing to accuse him of something morally devastating: stealing relief money during a pandemic, money intended for isolated elderly residents who depended on those meals to survive. Then U.S. Attorney Martin Estrada delivered the line that would define the scandal forever. He called Andrew Do Robin Hood in reverse, stealing from the poor to enrich the powerful. The phrase spread everywhere. National headlines, cable news, political commentary, and almost overnight, Andrew Do's legacy collapsed. But the investigation still wasn't finished, because prosecutors believed the corruption reached beyond one charity, beyond one politician, possibly beyond Orange County itself. As investigators kept digging, a deeper story emerged, one the public barely noticed at first, because according to a massive forensic audit released in 2026, the Viet America Society may have been only one piece of a much larger system. Auditors reviewed nearly $500 million in county contracts, and what they allegedly found painted a disturbing picture. Contracts repeatedly awarded without competitive bidding, vendors connected to political donors, money routed through respected community organizations before landing in private companies. Even cultural festivals allegedly became financial pipelines. The annual Tet and Moon Festival celebrations, beloved events inside Little Saigon, were reportedly transformed into discretionary spending systems controlled directly by Andrew Do's office. One company called 2T Media allegedly received more than $590,000 across multiple county contracts. Auditors questioned whether some agreements resembled retainers, payments issued regardless of whether actual services were performed, and perhaps most revealing of all, the audit described a county culture where oversight itself had become dangerous. Employees allegedly stopped challenging irregular contracts because they feared retaliation from Do's office. The system didn't just survive despite weak oversight. It depended on weak oversight, and by the end, investigators believed they weren't looking at a single corruption scheme anymore. They were looking at institutional capture, a public office allegedly transformed into a private financial network. But even as the walls closed in around Andrew Do, one major figure suddenly vanished. In June 2025, federal prosecutors unveiled another bombshell. Peter An Pham, the founder of the Viet America Society, was officially indicted. Prosecutors accused Pham and associates of embezzling nearly $12 million connected to pandemic relief funds. The allegations were massive: shell companies, property purchases, kickbacks, political corruption. But before authorities could fully move against him, Pham disappeared. By mid-2025, federal officials declared him a fugitive, his whereabouts unknown. And suddenly the scandal gained something even more dangerous: mystery. Because fugitives change public perception. They make corruption feel organized, international, calculated. People began asking questions nobody inside Orange County government wanted to answer. How many people knew? How long had this been happening? Was VAS really the beginning, or just the first organization investigators uncovered? And while prosecutors prepared their final case against Andrew Do, the public finally learned the full scale of what had allegedly happened during the pandemic. Millions, meant for vulnerable elderly residents, had instead fueled luxury homes, political favoritism, shell companies, and private enrichment. But the final collapse was still coming, and for Andrew Do, the end would arrive inside a federal courtroom. October 22nd, 2024. After months of investigation, Andrew Do finally resigned from the Orange County Board of Supervisors. The political career that had taken decades to build ended in silence. No triumphant final speech, no dramatic defense, just paperwork, court filings, and a guilty plea. Federal prosecutors charged Do with conspiracy to commit bribery concerning programs receiving federal funds. In exchange for pleading guilty, Do agreed to resign immediately. He also forfeited pension credits connected to the years prosecutors say he participated in the conspiracy. For Orange County residents, the plea confirmed their worst fears. The scandal wasn't political theater, it was real. A sitting county supervisor had admitted involvement in a federal bribery conspiracy tied directly to pandemic relief funding. But even then, the full emotional weight of the case still hadn't landed, because this wasn't simply about corruption. It was about timing. While families buried loved ones during COVID, while isolated seniors waited for food deliveries, public officials were allegedly turning emergency relief into private profit. That contrast is what made the scandal unforgettable. Not just greed, but greed during suffering, and prosecutors intended to make that point as clearly as possible during sentencing. June 9, 2025, Federal Court, Orange County. The room was quiet when Judge James V. Selma delivered the sentence. 5 years in federal prison, the maximum sentence allowed for the charge. For prosecutors, the punishment represented more than accountability. It was a warning, a message that exploiting emergency relief programs during a national crisis would not be tolerated, especially by elected officials entrusted with public money. The court also ordered Andrew Do to pay more than $878,000 in restitution. But by then, the damage extended far beyond money. Public trust had collapsed. Inside Little Saigon, many residents felt personally betrayed. Andrew Do wasn't just another politician. For many Vietnamese American families, he symbolized representation, community success, survival after displacement, and now that image had shattered publicly. But perhaps the most controversial outcome involved someone else entirely, his daughter, because while Andrew Do was heading to federal prison, Rhiannon Do managed to avoid felony conviction through a diversion agreement with prosecutors. She forfeited the $1 million Tustin property purchased with the funds. She admitted to violations involving false mortgage documents, but she was allowed to continue her legal studies. In fact, reports later revealed she graduated from law school and prepared for the California bar exam, which created another wave of outrage. Because for many observers, the scandal suddenly became about more than corruption. It became about accountability. Who actually pays the price and who escapes it? By the time forensic auditors released their findings in 2026, the public narrative had already solidified. Most people saw Andrew Do as a corrupt politician who stole COVID relief money. And technically, that was true. But auditors believed the deeper story was even more disturbing, because according to their findings, the scandal exposed systemic weaknesses across local government itself. Weak procurement systems, poor oversight, political favoritism, fear-based management, emergency powers with limited transparency. In other words, the system didn't fail accidentally. It failed exactly where pressure was weakest. And during emergencies, weak systems become opportunities. That's what made the scandal resonate nationally, because Orange County wasn't unique. During COVID, trillions of dollars moved rapidly across America under emergency conditions. Programs were created overnight. Oversight mechanisms collapsed under urgency. And across the country, fraud exploded. But few cases carried the emotional symbolism of Andrew Do's downfall, a refugee-turned-politician accused of exploiting elderly immigrants from his own community. A man once celebrated as proof of the American dream, now remembered as the face of a reverse Robin Hood scheme, stealing from vulnerable seniors to enrich political insiders. And maybe the darkest part of the story is how ordinary the corruption allegedly became. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just contracts, signatures, transfers, approvals, 1,000 quiet decisions, until millions disappeared. At the height of the pandemic, thousands of Orange County residents believed help was finally arriving. Government officials promised meals, relief, protection, and for many vulnerable seniors trapped inside their homes, those promises mattered, because during crises, people trust institutions to protect them. They trust elected officials to act responsibly when nobody else can. But according to federal prosecutors, that trust became a weapon. The money meant for struggling elderly residents allegedly traveled somewhere else entirely, into shell companies, mortgage payments, luxury property, political networks, and private bank accounts. Andrew Do once represented one of the most inspiring stories in Orange County politics. A refugee who escaped war, built a legal career, rose into power, and became one of the most influential Vietnamese American politicians in California. But in the end, his story became something else. A warning about what happens when emergency power operates without oversight, about how corruption rarely begins with suitcases full of cash. It begins quietly. Inside systems people stop questioning, inside offices where employees become afraid to speak, inside communities where trust becomes political currency. And by the time the public notices, the damage is already done, because the most dangerous corruption isn't the kind hiding in darkness. It's the kind happening in plain sight, while everyone believes they're being helped. One of the most unsettling details uncovered by investigators had nothing to do with money. It was psychology. Because according to the 2026 forensic audit, the corruption surrounding Andrew Do allegedly survived through something far more powerful than bribery alone: fear. Employees reportedly described an atmosphere where questioning contracts tied to Do's office could trigger backlash, pressure, or humiliation. Some staff allegedly learned it was safer not to ask questions at all. And that detail matters, because corruption rarely succeeds through intelligence alone. It succeeds when institutions become emotionally conditioned to stop resisting, when procedures become optional, when silence becomes survival. That's how systems slowly rot from the inside, not through one giant criminal act, but through hundreds of smaller moments where people decide staying quiet is easier. Investigators later described how anti-abuse safeguards simply stopped functioning around Do's district operations. Competitive bidding vanished. Documentation gaps were ignored. Oversight procedures became obstacles instead of protections. And inside that vacuum, money flowed almost unchecked. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation wasn't how the money moved. It was how normal the operation allegedly became. Because according to auditors, by the end, the system appeared almost institutionalized, routine, predictable, comfortable, which raises a terrifying possibility. If journalists had never started asking questions, would anyone have stopped it at all? Few parts of the scandal generated more public anger than the story of Rhiannon Do, because psychologically, she transformed the case from political corruption into something more intimate: dynastic corruption. Family enrichment, a political network allegedly designed to benefit insiders across generations. According to prosecutors, Rhiannon Do wasn't just passively connected to the operation. She allegedly received monthly payments tied to entities funded through county contracts. Then came the Tustin House, a $1.035 million property purchased while millions in relief money flowed through Vietnamese-linked accounts. Federal investigators later claimed falsified mortgage documents helped secure financing. And yet, despite the admissions contained within diversion agreements, Rhiannon ultimately avoided felony prosecution. That outcome divided public opinion instantly. Some believed prosecutors strategically prioritized Andrew Do himself. Others believed the system once again protected connected individuals differently than ordinary citizens. But another detail quietly fueled outrage. She was allowed to continue pursuing a legal career. To many observers, that detail felt surreal, because while vulnerable elderly residents allegedly lost resources intended to help them survive the pandemic, a law student connected to the scandal was still moving toward becoming an attorney. And suddenly the scandal evolved again, no longer just about theft, but fairness. Who gets second chances? Who receives mercy? And who becomes permanently destroyed by scandal? Because in America, justice is rarely judged only by verdicts. It's judged by comparison. One of the least publicized findings from the forensic audit involved cultural festivals, and in many ways, it revealed how deeply politics and community identity had become intertwined inside Orange County. Tet festivals aren't just celebrations. For Vietnamese American communities, they represent memory, identity, survival after displacement. They symbolize continuity after war and migration, which is exactly why the allegations surrounding those events hit so hard. According to auditors, county-sponsored Tet and Moon Festival contracts allegedly became vehicles for discretionary spending controlled directly through Do's office. Certain vendors reportedly received repeated contracts without competitive bidding. One company, 2T Media, allegedly collected hundreds of thousands of dollars through county agreements auditors questioned heavily. Some contracts allegedly resembled retainers, payments disconnected from measurable deliverables. And then came perhaps the most spiteful detail uncovered in the audit. Right before resigning, records showed Andrew Do allegedly drained the district's discretionary event funds almost entirely. The result? The following year's Tet Festival had to be canceled. For many residents, that cancellation became symbolic. The corruption didn't just steal money, it damaged community traditions themselves. And psychologically, that mattered more than investigators initially realized, because political scandals fade, but cultural betrayal lingers, especially in immigrant communities built around trust, representation, and survival. The phrase reverse Robin Hood became famous because it simplified the scandal into one devastating image, stealing from the poor to enrich the powerful. But emotionally, the reality was even darker because the victims were largely invisible. Homebound seniors, immigrant families, elderly residents isolated by language barriers and fear during COVID lockdowns, people unlikely to hold press conferences or dominate national headlines, which made the alleged exploitation feel especially predatory. Federal prosecutors understood this immediately. That's why the case resonated beyond California. It tapped into something Americans were already afraid of after the pandemic. That emergency systems designed to help ordinary people had quietly become opportunities for abuse. And the more details emerged, the worse the optics became. Luxury homes, shell companies, political insiders, missing oversight. Meanwhile, food insecurity among seniors continued rising during portions of the pandemic itself. That contrast became emotionally radioactive, not because Americans were shocked corruption existed, but because of when it allegedly happened, during mass death, during lockdowns, during national fear, at a moment when public trust mattered most. And perhaps that's why the Andrew Do scandal spread so rapidly across media, because deep down, people recognized it as part of a much larger anxiety. What happens when institutions stop protecting the vulnerable and start protecting themselves? Even after guilty pleas, raids, indictments, and prison sentences, major questions still remain unanswered. How many people truly knew what was happening? Did others inside county government knowingly enable the contracts? Were additional organizations involved beyond those publicly named? And perhaps most importantly, how many similar systems exist elsewhere without detection? Because investigators repeatedly hinted the corruption surrounding Andrew Do may have extended beyond one nonprofit. The 2026 forensic audit suggested broader procurement manipulation tied to political relationships and donor-connected vendors. Federal investigations connected to the case remain ongoing, and the disappearance of Peter An Pham only intensified speculation. A fugitive changes the psychology of a scandal because fugitives imply hidden information, unknown risks, loose ends. As long as Pham remains missing, the story feels unfinished, which means the public continues imagining possibilities investigators may never fully confirm. And in corruption cases, uncertainty becomes its own form of damage. It erodes confidence permanently because once citizens believe public systems can be manipulated quietly, every future contract starts looking suspicious too. In the end, the Andrew Do scandal wasn't just about one politician. It was about systems, about trust, about how easily public institutions can drift away from the people they were built to protect, especially during emergencies. Andrew Do arrived in America as a refugee fleeing instability and collapse. He built influence inside a community that viewed him as proof that survival could become success. For decades, that story inspired people. But power changes narratives, and sometimes the most dangerous corruption comes from individuals who already understand exactly how vulnerable communities think, how they trust, how they rally behind familiar faces, how they hesitate to question their own leaders. That's what made this scandal so devastating inside Little Saigon. It didn't feel like an outside attack. It felt internal, personal, and maybe that's the real lesson hidden underneath the headlines. Corruption rarely looks evil while it's happening. It looks administrative, routine, professional, a signed document, a rushed approval, a contract nobody reviews closely enough. Until one day, millions are gone, careers collapse, communities fracture, and the people who needed help most realized they were never the priority at all. Because the scariest part of the Andrew Do scandal isn't that it happened, it's how long it allegedly operated before anyone stopped it.